He only had $20 left to his name, barely enough to feed his own family for the rest of the week. But when Joe Morris saw the young soldier sitting outside the diner counting pocket change with tears in her eyes, he knew what he had to do. What he didn't expect was for her to reach into her worn backpack 30 minutes later and hand him a set of keys that would completely transform his life forever. What started as a simple act of kindness between strangers would become a story of second chances, hidden connections, and the kind of miracle that proves sometimes the universe has been waiting for just the right moment to change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late October wind cut through downtown Millfield like a knife, sending dried leaves skittering across the cracked sidewalks and rattling the loose windows of the old storefronts that lined Maple Street. Joe Morris pulled his thin denim jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked past the row of struggling businesses, a pawn shop with bars on the windows, a used clothing store with a flickering neon sign, and a corner market that had seen better days but still managed to stay open later than anywhere else in town. His work boots made a hollow sound against the concrete. The worn sole is so thin he could feel every crack and imperfection in the sidewalk beneath his feet. The boots had been good quality once, back when he'd first started working at the packaging warehouse on the outskirts of town. But that was over 2 years ago. Now they were held together more by duct tape and determination than by the original stitching. Joe's jeans told a similar story. Faded blue denim with patches on both knees and a small tear near the back pocket that seemed to grow a little larger each time he washed them. His t-shirt, once a deep navy blue, had faded to a pale gray that matched the October sky hanging heavy and threatening above the tired little town of Millfield. But none of his worn clothing mattered as much as the weight, or rather, the lack of weight of the wallet in his back pocket. $23.47. Joe knew the exact amount because he'd counted it 3 times that morning, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change, that somehow a few extra bills would materialize between the cracked leather folds. They hadn't. The temp agency had laid him off 2 days ago when the packaging contract ended earlier than expected. Nothing personal, Morris, the supervisor had said, not even looking up from his clipboard. Just the way business goes sometimes. We'll call you when something else comes up. Joe had nodded and walked out without arguing, because arguing wouldn't change anything, and pride didn't pay the bills. But as he'd driven home in his battered 1998 Ford pickup truck, the one with the passenger door that stuck in the heater, that only worked when it felt like it, the reality of his situation had settled over him like a lead blanket. $23.47 to last until the temp agency called with another assignment. $23.47 to keep the lights on, put gas in the truck, and feed his 8-year-old son Tommy until anything came through. Tommy, just thinking about his boy, sent a familiar mixture of love and anxiety coursing through Joe's chest. The kid was everything good in Joe's world, smart as a whip, funny in ways that caught Joe off guard, and resilient in ways no 8-year-old should have to be. Tommy had never complained about the second-hand clothes, or the generic brand cereal, or the fact that they lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage instead of a real house with a yard. The boy had lost his mother when he was barely 3 years old. Leukemia had taken Sarah Morris in less than 6 months, leaving Joe to figure out how to be both father and mother to a toddler who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. Those first few years had been a blur of daycare pickups and midnight fevers and trying to learn how to braid hair from YouTube videos, while Tommy sat patiently on the bathroom counter, swinging his little legs and chattering about dinosaurs. Now Tommy was 8. All knees and elbows and endless energy, with Sarah's dark eyes and her infectious laugh. He was currently at his best friend Marcus's house, working on what he'd described as the most important science project in the history of third grade. Something involving baking soda volcanoes and food coloring that Joe was certain would end. With both boys covered in fake lava. Joe had promised to pick Tommy up by 6 o'clock, which gave him just enough time to grab something quick for dinner and make it across town to the suburban neighborhood where Marcus lived. The problem was that something quick for dinner had become a careful calculation of dollars and cents, of choosing between name brand and generic, between enough food for today and enough money for tomorrow. He paused outside Rosie's Diner, the one establishment on Maple Street that had managed to weather every economic storm Millfield had faced over the past 3 decades. The building was small and unpretentious, with faded red brick walls and a hand-painted sign that proclaimed good food, fair prices, all welcome, in cheerful yellow letters that had been retouched so many times they were slightly crooked. Through the steamed-up windows, Joe could see the familiar interior red vinyl booths with chrome edges, a long counter with spinning stools, and walls covered with framed photographs of local high school football teams and Little League champions from years gone by. The smell of coffee and fried onions drifted out every time someone opened the door, making Joe's stomach growl in response. He'd eaten lunch at Rosie's exactly once in the past month. On the day he'd gotten paid from his last temp job, the memory of Rosie's famous meatloaf and mashed potatoes was enough to make his mouth water, but he forced himself to keep walking. $23.47 didn't leave room for restaurant meals, no matter how reasonable Rosie's prices were. Instead, Joe headed for the corner market, where he could pick up bread, peanut butter, and maybe some bananas, enough to keep Tommy fed for a few days while he waited for the phone to ring with news of another job. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As he approached the market, Joe noticed the broken streetlight that had been flickering on and off for weeks, casting strange shadows across the sidewalk. The city had promised to fix it, along with the pothole on 5th Street and the stop sign that had been knocked crooked by a delivery truck last month. But promises didn't seem to translate into action very quickly in Millfield. The irony wasn't lost on Joe that he was walking past dozens of things that needed fixing: broken lights, cracked sidewalks, peeling paint on storefronts, while he himself was struggling just to stay afloat. He'd always been good with his hands, good at figuring out how things worked and how to make them work better. His father had taught him basic carpentry and engine repair when he was Tommy's age, and Joe had picked up electrical work and plumbing during his various jobs over the years. But being skilled at fixing things didn't matter much when you didn't have the money to buy tools, or a truck reliable enough to haul equipment, or the capital to start your own business. In Millfield, like in so many small towns across the country, good intentions and hard work weren't always enough to overcome the basic mathematics of survival. Joe reached for the market's door handle, steeling himself for the careful calculation that would determine what he and Tommy would eat for the next few days. $23.47. It would have to be enough because it was all he had. But as Joe's hand touched the cold metal of the door handle, movement in his peripheral vision made him pause. Something or someone was sitting in the shadowed alcove beside Rosie's Diner, just barely visible in the dim light cast by the restaurant's neon sign. At first glance, it looked like just another person down on their luck, the kind of sight that had become increasingly common in Millfield as jobs disappeared and opportunities dwindled. Joe had learned, like most people in town, to look away quickly and keep walking. Not out of cruelness, but out of self-preservation. When you were barely keeping your own head above water, you couldn't afford to take on someone else's drowning. But something about this particular figure made him stop and look more carefully. She sat on the concrete steps beside the diner's side entrance, partially hidden in the shadow of the building's small overhang. Her posture was what caught Joe's attention first: ramrod straight despite her obvious exhaustion, shoulders squared in a way that spoke of military training. Even sitting on cold concrete in what was clearly a moment of desperation, she maintained the kind of bearing that suggested discipline and pride. The woman Joe could see now that it was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, wore a faded but clean army jacket over dark jeans and combat boots that had seen serious wear, but were still meticulously maintained. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite the fact that she was clearly in some kind of distress, everything about her appearance spoke of someone who took care of herself and maintained standards even when circumstances were working against her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was what she was doing that made Joe's chest tighten with recognition and sympathy. In her lap, spread out on a small piece of cardboard that looked like it had been torn from a shipping box, she had arranged a collection of coins in careful, precise rows. Quarters in one line, dimes in another, nickels and pennies sorted with the kind of methodical attention to detail that reminded Joe of his own morning ritual of counting and recounting his meager finances. She was moving the coins around with her index finger, grouping and regrouping them, her lips moving silently as she calculated and recalculated whatever total they represented. Even from a distance, Joe could see that there wasn't much there, maybe $3 or $4 in loose change, the kind of money that might buy a cup of coffee and a donut if you were lucky. The young woman's face was turned downward, focused intently on her counting, but Joe caught glimpses of her profile in the shifting light from the diner's window. She had strong features, a determined jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that even in shadow seemed to carry more weight than someone her age should bear. There was something familiar about that expression, the particular kind of exhaustion that came not just from physical tiredness, but from carrying responsibilities that were too heavy for one person to manage alone. Joe recognized it, because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. As he watched the woman finished counting her coins for what was obviously not the first time, she sat back against the brick wall of the diner, closing her eyes for a moment and taking a deep breath that seemed to carry all the weariness in the world. When she opened her eyes again, Joe saw her glance toward the diner's main entrance, then down at her small pile of change, then back at the entrance again. The calculation was obvious and heartbreaking. She was trying to figure out if she had enough money to buy food, and from the defeated slump of her shoulders, it was clear that the answer was no. Joe felt his stomach clench, and it wasn't from hunger this time. Here was someone who had served their country. The army jacket and military bearing made that clear sitting on a street corner, trying to scrape together enough change for a meal. The injustice of it hit him like a physical blow, the same way it always did when he encountered evidence that the system was failing the very people who had sacrificed the most to protect it. He knew he should keep walking. He knew that $23.47 didn't leave room for acts of charity, no matter how well-intentioned. He knew that Tommy was depending on him to be practical, to be responsible, to put his son's needs ahead of impulses to help strangers. But as Joe stood there watching this young soldier count pennies in the shadow of a diner, he heard his father's voice in his memory as clearly as if the old man were standing right beside him. "Son," his father had said during one of their many talks on the front porch of the house where Joe had grown up, "there's going to come times in your life when you have to choose between what's smart and what's right. And I can't tell you which choice to make, because that's something every man has to figure out for himself. But I can tell you this, when you're lying in bed at night, replaying the day in your mind, it's not the smart choices that'll keep you awake. It's the times you had a chance to do right and chose not to." The memory was so vivid that Joe could almost smell the cigarette his father had been smoking, could almost feel the warm summer air and hear the distant sound of crickets chirping in the gathering dusk. His father had been a man of few words but strong convictions, the kind of person who measured wealth not in dollars, but in the ability to look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. Joe glanced back toward the corner market, where he'd been planning to carefully select the cheapest possible combination of bread and peanut butter to stretch his money as far as it would go. Then he looked back at the young woman, who was now carefully gathering up her coins and placing them in what looked like a small cloth pouch. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to handle every possession as if it were precious, because for her, it was. Joe recognized that kind of careful attention to detail, the way people moved when they couldn't afford to lose anything, no matter how small. As if sensing his scrutiny, the woman looked up and caught him staring. For a moment, their eyes met across the 20 feet of sidewalk that separated them, and Joe felt something pass between them, not romantic, not even really personal, but a recognition of shared struggle, of understanding what it meant to count every penny and still come up short. Instead of looking away embarrassed, or appearing annoyed at his attention, the young soldier offered him a small, tired smile. It was the kind of smile that managed to be both grateful and apologetic at the same time. Grateful for being seen as a human being, rather than just another problem to be ignored, and apologetic for existing in a space where she might make other people uncomfortable. "Evening," she said softly, her voice carrying the clear diction that suggested military training, but also a warmth that spoke of someone who understood the value of basic human courtesy, even in difficult circumstances. "Evening," Joe replied, taking a few steps closer. "You doing all right?" It was a stupid question, and they both knew it. Someone who was doing all right didn't sit on concrete steps outside a diner counting pocket change in the growing darkness of an October evening. But it was the kind of question that opened doors, that gave people permission to be honest about their circumstances if they chose to be. The young woman hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her options. She could brush him off with a polite lie, maintaining her dignity by pretending everything was fine. She could ask for help directly, risking rejection and embarrassment. Or she could find some middle ground that acknowledged the reality of her situation without completely surrendering her pride. "Just trying to figure out my options," she said finally, gesturing toward the small pouch of coins. "Been a longer day than I planned for." Joe nodded, understanding the weight of words not spoken. In his experience, when someone said it had been a longer day than planned, it usually meant that plans had fallen apart entirely and they were now in survival mode, trying to figure out how to get through the next few hours. "Mind if I ask when you last ate?" Joe said, his voice gentle but direct. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her carefully maintained composure finally showing cracks around the edges. The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats, and Joe could see the internal struggle playing out across the young woman's face. Military training had clearly taught her to project strength and self-sufficiency, but hunger and exhaustion were breaking down those carefully constructed walls. Finally, she looked down at her hands and spoke so quietly that Joe had to strain to hear her. "Yesterday morning," she said. "Maybe the day before." Time gets a little fuzzy when you're traveling. The admission hit Joe like a punch to the gut. Yesterday morning. That meant she'd been without food for at least 36 hours, probably longer. He thought about Tommy, who got cranky if dinner was delayed by even an hour, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to go days without eating. Joe's hand instinctively moved toward his back pocket, where his wallet rested like a lead weight against his hip. $23.47. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a decent meal at Rosie's, maybe even 2 meals, if they ordered carefully, but it was also enough to keep Tommy fed for 3 days. It was gas money to get to job interviews. It was the difference between having their electricity shut off and having lights for another week. The practical part of his brain, the part that had learned to survive through 5 years of single parenthood and sporadic employment, was screaming at him to walk away, to Offer a kind word maybe, or directions to the nearest homeless shelter, but to keep his money in his pocket where it belonged. To be responsible. To think about his own family first. But there was another voice in his head, one that sounded suspiciously like his late wife Sarah. She'd always been the one to stop for stranded motorists, to bring extra food to church potlucks, for families who couldn't afford to contribute, to see need and respond to it without calculating the cost. Joe remembered the way she'd looked at him during those moments, not with judgment for his caution, but with quiet encouragement to be better than his fears. Sarah would have already invited her in, he thought, and the certainty of it settled over him like a warm blanket. Joe pulled out his wallet, feeling the worn leather soft and familiar in his hands. Inside, the $20 bill looked impossibly small and impossibly large at the same time, small compared to the magnitude of problems it couldn't solve, large compared to what little security it represented. "Ma'am," he said, stepping closer to where the young soldier sat. "I'm Joe Morris, and I'm about to head into Rosie's for some dinner. Would you do me the honor of joining me?" The woman's eyes went wide, and she immediately began shaking her head. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. Thank you, but I'm fine. Really, I am. When's the last time you had a hot meal?" Joe pressed gently, crouching down so he was at her eye level. Not a vending machine snack or gas station sandwich. An actual hot meal. Hot meal. The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of admission settled over her. "I can't remember," she whispered, so quietly that Joe almost didn't catch the words. "Then it's settled," Joe said, extending his hand to help her up. "I'm buying you dinner, and I won't take no for an answer." "Sir, you don't understand," the woman said, her voice stronger now but tinged with desperation. "I can't pay you back. I don't have any money, and I don't know when I will, and I can't accept charity from someone who probably needs their money just as much as I do." Joe looked at her for a long moment, taking in the pride that kept her back straight, even as she sat on cold concrete, the dignity that made her refuse help even when she was clearly starving. He saw something of himself in that stubborn independence, the same fierce determination to handle problems alone that had gotten him through the worst days after Sarah's death. "What's your name?" he asked. "Autumn," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Autumn Coleman." "Well, Autumn Coleman," Joe said, his voice taking on the same tone he used when Tommy was being particularly stubborn about taking medicine or eating vegetables. "This isn't charity. This is dinner between two people who've probably both had some hard times lately. And right now, I could use the company more than I need the money." It wasn't entirely true. He needed the money desperately, but it wasn't entirely false either. There was something about this young woman, something about the way she carried herself despite her circumstances, that reminded him of what it felt like to have hope. And he realized, somewhat to his surprise, that he'd been hungry for that. Feeling almost as much as she'd been hungry for food. Autumn studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to read his intentions. Joe could see her weighing her options, calculating the risk of trusting a stranger against the very real need for food and basic human kindness. "I served 2 tours overseas," she said suddenly, as if offering credentials for why she deserved help. I'm not usually like this. Sitting on street corners, I mean. I'm between places right now, and things got complicated, and..." "You don't owe me your story," Joe said gently. "You just owe me the courtesy of letting me buy you a meal." He stood up and extended his hand again, more insistently this time. "Come on, Autumn Coleman. Let's get you something to eat before Rosie runs out of the good stuff." For another moment, Autumn hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached up and took his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her grip was stronger than he'd expected, calloused from work but steady despite her exhaustion. As she stood, Joe got a better look at her. She was taller than he'd initially thought, probably close to 5'8", with the kind of lean build that suggested both physical fitness and too little food. Her army jacket was faded but clean, and underneath it she wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days, but were well maintained. Most striking were her eyes, a clear, bright green that seemed to hold depths Joe couldn't quite fathom. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things, done things, experienced life in ways that left permanent marks. But they were also kind eyes, intelligent eyes, the eyes of someone who understood the weight of the moment they were sharing. "Thank you," Autumn said, and Joe could hear the genuine gratitude in her voice. I can't tell you how much this means." "You don't have to," Joe replied, moving toward the diner's main entrance. "We've all been there, one way or another." As they approached the door, Joe felt a moment of vertigo, as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff and contemplating a jump into unknown waters. $23.47. After dinner, he'd probably have maybe $5 or $6 left. Not enough for groceries. Barely enough for gas to get Tommy to school for the rest of the week. But as he reached for the door handle of Rosie's Diner, Joe thought about the lesson his father had tried to teach him about the difference between smart choices and right choices. And he thought about Sarah, who had never met a hungry person she wouldn't feed or a lost soul she wouldn't try to help find their way home. Sometimes, he thought, pulling open the door and holding it for Autumn, being broke and being poor aren't the same thing. The warmth from inside the diner washed over them as they stepped across the threshold, carrying with it the smell of coffee and home-cooked food and the promise of at least one small moment of comfort in what had clearly been a difficult day. For both of them, behind them, the cold October wind continued to rattle the windows and send leaves skittering across the empty sidewalk. But inside Rosie's Diner, as Joe guided Autumn toward an empty booth near the back, something new was beginning, something neither of them could have predicted when they'd started this day, but something that would change the trajectory of both. Their lives forever. The interior of Rosie's Diner was a time capsule from a different era, when diners were gathering places for entire communities, and a cup of coffee came with unlimited refills and genuine conversation. The black and white checkerboard linoleum floor had been worn smooth by decades of work boots and dress shoes, creating a path of memory that led from the front door to the long counter lined with red vinyl stools. The booths that lined the windows were upholstered in the same red vinyl, cracked in places and patched with silver duct tape, but clean and comfortable in the way that mattered most to people who appreciated basic dignity over fancy decoration. Each booth had its own individual jukebox selector, though most of them hadn't worked since the Clinton administration, and the walls were covered with framed photographs that told the story of Millfield through decades of high school graduations, church picnics, and Little League championships. The dinner crowd was typical for a Tuesday evening in late October, sparse but steady, composed mostly of people who understood the value of a place like Rosie's. In one corner booth, an elderly couple shared a piece of apple pie and quiet conversation, their gnarled hands occasionally reaching across the table to touch each other with the casual intimacy of 60 years together. At the counter, a long haul trucker worked his way through a plate of meatloaf while studying a road atlas, plotting routes between cities whose names Joe recognized from highway signs but had never visited. Near the front, two local mechanics still wearing their work uniforms compared notes about a stubborn transmission while picking at orders of chicken fried steak. Joe recognized them both: Bobby Chun from the Sinclair station and Martinez's nephew who worked at the Ford dealership, but he didn't know them well enough for more than a nod of acknowledgement. The familiar sounds of the diner wrapped around Joe and Autumn as they settled into a booth near the back, the gentle clatter of dishes being cleared, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low murmur of conversations that had been interrupted by their arrival but were already resuming as curiosity gave way to small-town politeness. Joe chose the seat facing the front of the diner, partly from habit and partly because he could see that Autumn was scanning their surroundings with the systematic attention of someone trained to assess potential threats and escape routes. Her eyes moved quickly but methodically, cataloging exits and obstacles, identifying other patrons, and evaluating whether they represented any kind of danger. That it was the kind of behavior Joe had seen before in veterans who had served in combat zones, the hyper-awareness that came from too many months in places where letting your guard down could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. He understood it, respected it, and made no comment about it, instead focusing on making Autumn feel as safe and comfortable as possible. "You can see the whole room from here," he said quietly, settling into his seat across from her. "And there's a back exit through the kitchen if you need it." Autumn's eyes snapped to his face, surprise flickering across her features. Most civilians didn't recognize the signs of battlefield conditioning, much less accommodate them so matter-of-factly. "Force of habit," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "Nothing wrong with being aware of your surroundings," Joe replied easily. "My daddy always said a smart person knows where the doors are." The waitress who approached their table was exactly what central casting would have ordered for a small-town diner, middle-aged, practical, with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that came from 30 years of carrying plates and pouring coffee for people who measured their tips in loose change rather than percentages. Her name tag read Dolores, and her gray hair was pulled back in a bun that suggested she had no patience for anything that might get in the way of doing her job well. "Evening, folks," Dolores said, pulling 2 menus from her apron and setting them on the table, along with 2 glasses of ice water. "First time in for both of you?" "First time for my friend here," Joe said, nodding toward Autumn. "I've been in a few times before." Dolores studied Autumn with the frank appraisal of someone who had seen every kind of customer walk through Rosie's doors over the years: flush college students celebrating good grades, farmers celebrating good harvests, families celebrating birthdays with carefully budgeted splurges, and people like Autumn, who weren't celebrating anything but were grateful for basic warmth and kindness. "Well, honey," Dolores said to Autumn, her voice carrying the maternal warmth that seemed to be a job requirement for diner waitresses, "you just let me know if you need anything explained. We do most everything from scratch here, and Rosie's been cooking the same way for 40 years, so you can't really go wrong." Autumn accepted the menu with hands that Joe noticed were steadier than they'd been outside, though she still kept her Army-issue backpack close beside her in the booth. The pack was worn but well-maintained, the kind of gear that spoke of someone who understood the importance of taking care of equipment, because your life might depend on it someday. "Take your time looking things over," Joe said, opening his own menu even though he'd memorized it weeks ago. "Everything here is good, but the meatloaf is probably the best deal if you're really hungry." Autumn studied the menu with the intense concentration of someone for whom the decision represented more than just a preference between dishes. Joe could see her calculating prices, comparing portion sizes, trying to find the intersection between what she wanted and what she thought Joe could afford. "Order whatever looks good to you," Joe said gently, recognizing the internal struggle. "Don't worry about the price." "I can't let you spend a lot of money on me," Autumn said, looking up from the menu with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Joe replied. "I know you served your country. I know you're trying to get somewhere important to you. And I know you haven't eaten in 2 days, which means you're going to order something substantial. Or I'm going to order for you." It was said with enough humor to soften the ultimatum, but Autumn could hear the steel underneath Joe's gentle tone. This was a man who was accustomed to taking care of people, who understood that sometimes kindness required a certain degree of insistence. When Dolores returned with a pot of coffee and the practiced efficiency of someone who could pour without looking, Autumn finally made her decision. "Could I have the pot roast dinner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "With the mashed potatoes and green beans?" "Excellent choice, honey," Dolores said, scribbling on her order pad. "That comes with a dinner roll and butter, and I'll make sure Rosie gives you extra gravy. And for you, sir?" Joe glanced at the menu one more time, doing quick calculations in his head. The pot roast dinner was $12, which left him with about $11 for his own meal. The soup and salad combination would be enough to fill him up and still leave a few dollars for Dolores's tip. "I'll take the vegetable soup and house salad," he said, handing back his menu. Autumn started to protest clearly, recognizing that he was ordering the cheapest items on the menu while she was getting one of the most expensive. But Joe cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "The soup here is famous," he said, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't entirely false either. "My late wife always said the secret to a good relationship was never arguing with someone who's buying you dinner." The mention of his wife seemed to settle something for Autumn, as if the reference to loss created a bridge of understanding between them. She nodded and sat back in the booth, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders as the reality of hot food and basic human kindness began to sink in. As they waited for their food, the conversation started slowly, the way it does between strangers who are trying to navigate the delicate balance between politeness and genuine connection. Joe poured cream into his coffee and watched as Autumn wrapped her hands around her mug, clearly savoring the warmth that radiated through the ceramic. "So what brings you to Millfield?" Joe asked, stirring his coffee absently. "Not exactly a destination most people plan to visit." Autumn managed a small smile at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her since they'd met. "You're not wrong about that. I'm actually passing through on my way to Colorado. Was stationed at Fort Henderson, about 4 hours south of here, and I just finished my discharge process last week." "Long way from Colorado," Joe observed. "That's quite a journey on a shoestring budget." The comment was gentle but direct, acknowledging what they both knew, that Autumn's current circumstances weren't exactly conducive to long-distance travel. She appreciated his honesty, the way he didn't pretend not to notice her obvious financial difficulties. "I thought I had a ride lined up with another soldier who was heading west," Autumn explained, tracing patterns on the table with her finger. "But his plans changed at the last minute, and I couldn't afford a bus ticket for the full distance. So I've been taking buses when I can afford them, hitchhiking when I can't, and walking when both of those options run out." Joe felt his chest tighten at the image of this young woman walking along highways with nothing but a backpack, trying to cover hundreds of miles on foot. The dangers alone were enough to keep him awake at night if he thought about them too long. But there was something else that bothered him even more: the systematic failure of support that led to veterans ending up in such desperate circumstances. "How long have you been traveling like this?" he asked. "About a week," Autumn said. "Maybe 8 days. Time gets a little fuzzy when you're focused on just getting through each day." Dolores appeared at their table with practiced efficiency, setting down Autumn's pot roast dinner with a flourish that suggested genuine pride in the food she was serving. The plate was generous, almost to the point of excess, thick slices of tender beef swimming in rich brown gravy, a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes, fresh green beans that actually looked fresh, and a dinner roll that was still warm from the oven. Joe's soup and salad looked respectable but modest by comparison, which was exactly what he'd intended. He watched as Autumn stared at her plate for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real, before picking up her fork with hands that trembled slightly. The first bite seemed to hit her like a revelation. She closed her eyes briefly, chewing slowly, and Joe could see the exact moment when the reality of hot, well-prepared food registered in her system. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "This is incredible," she said softly. "I'd forgotten what real food tastes like." "Rosie's got a gift," Joe agreed, though he was more focused on watching Autumn eat than on his own meal. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing someone who had been genuinely hungry finally getting properly fed. It reminded him of the early days with Tommy, when a simple meal could transform his son's entire mood and energy level. As Autumn worked her way through the pot roast, Joe found himself studying her more carefully. She ate with purpose but not desperation, maintaining her dignity even in the face of obvious hunger. Her mannerisms suggested education and upbringing, the kind of background that made her current circumstances all the more striking. "What about you?" Autumn asked between bites. "Born and raised in Millfield?" "Third generation," Joe confirmed. "My grandfather worked at the textile mill before it closed in the 80s. My dad drove trucks until his back gave out. And me, I work whatever jobs I can find to keep food on the table for my son." "You have a son?" Autumn's face lit up with genuine interest. "Tommy. He's 8 years old, smart as a whip, and the best thing that ever happened to me." Joe's entire demeanor shifted when he talked about his boy, the weariness falling away from his features like a curtain being pulled back. "He's at his friend's house right now, probably covered in baking soda and food coloring from some science project that's way more complicated than it needs to be." "What happened to his mother?" Autumn asked gently, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "I shouldn't have. It's all right," Joe said, holding up a hand to stop her apology. "Sarah died when Tommy was 3. Leukemia. It happened fast, 6 months from diagnosis to the end." Autumn set down her fork and looked at him with the kind of understanding that only came from personal experience with loss. "I'm so sorry, that must have been devastating." "It was," Joe said simply. "For a while there, I wasn't sure how we were going to make it. A 3-year-old asking for his mama every night. Me trying to figure out how to be both parents while dealing with medical bills and funeral expenses, and just ... everything." He paused, stirring his soup though it didn't need stirring. "But Tommy saved me, in a way. Kids have this ability to keep you focused on what matters. He needed me to get up every morning, so I got up. He needed breakfast, so I learned to cook. He needed bedtime stories, so I learned to read with voices." "Sounds like he's lucky to have you," Autumn said. "I'm the lucky one," Joe replied immediately. "He reminds me every day that there's still good in the world, still reasons to hope things can get better." Autumn nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "I lost my best friend in Afghanistan," she said quietly. "Sergeant Lisa Chun. We served together for 2 years, went through basic training together, shared a tent for most of our deployment. She was ... she was like the sister I never had." Joe waited, sensing there was more to the story. "We were on a supply run when our convoy hit an IED," Autumn continued, her voice steady but distant. "I was in the lead vehicle, she was in the truck. Behind me. I walked away with some scratches and a concussion. She didn't walk away at all. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of survivor's guilt, and the particular kind of grief that came from losing someone in circumstances beyond anyone's control. "That's why you're going to Colorado?" Joe asked gently. Autumn nodded. "Lisa's parents invited me to visit her grave, to be part of a memorial service they're having on the anniversary of her death. It's been 2 years, and I haven't been able to make the trip until now. But I promised her before we deployed that if anything happened to either of us, the other one would make sure her parents knew how much she loved them." Joe felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the depth of loyalty and love that had driven this young woman to travel hundreds of miles with almost no resources, just to keep a promise to a dead friend. "That's beautiful," he said. "Hard but beautiful." "She would have done the same for me," Autumn said simply. "Actually, she would have done it better. Lisa was always the one who remembered birthdays and called people when they were sick and made sure everyone felt included. I'm not naturally good at those things, but I'm learning." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each processing the weight of what the other had shared. Joe realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness, buying dinner for a hungry stranger, had become something much deeper. In the space of an hour, they had moved from being strangers to being people who understood each other's losses, who recognized the particular kind of strength it took to keep moving forward when everything you loved had been taken away. "Can I ask you something?" Autumn said, pushing the last few bites of pot roast around her plate. "Sure. Earlier, when you offered to buy me dinner, you could tell I was broke, right? But you gave me your money anyway, even though you clearly don't have much yourself. Why?" Joe considered the question, trying to find words for something he'd felt rather than thought through logically. "I guess," he said finally, "because I know what it's like to feel invisible. After Sarah died, people were very kind for a while. But eventually life moved on, and everyone went back to their own problems. There were times when I felt like Tommy, and I could disappear, and nobody would notice for weeks." He met her eyes across the table. "You weren't invisible to me tonight, Autumn. And I figured maybe that was worth $20. The silence that followed Joe's words was the kind that felt sacred, heavy with unspoken understanding, and the recognition that something significant had just passed between them. Autumn looked down at her nearly empty plate, then back up at Joe, and he could see that she was struggling to find adequate words for what his kindness had meant to her. "Thank you," she said finally, and the simple phrase carried more weight than entire speeches Joe had heard from people who used many more words to say much less. "Not just for the food, though this meal probably saved my life, but for seeing me. For treating me like a human being instead of a problem to be avoided." Joe nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He'd been there himself in those dark months after Sarah's death, when well-meaning people would cross the street to avoid having to make awkward small talk with the widower who reminded them that terrible things could happen to good people. "We should probably head out soon," Joe said, glancing at the old clock on the diner's wall. "I promised to pick up Tommy by 6, and it's already 5:15. "Of course," Autumn said immediately, beginning to gather her backpack. "I've taken up way too much of your time already." "Actually," Joe said, the idea forming as he spoke, "would you like to come with me? Tommy's at his friend's house just across town, and I thought maybe you'd like to meet him. He's always excited to meet new people, especially if they have good stories." Autumn paused in her movements, clearly taken aback by the invitation. "Are you sure? I mean, I don't want to impose, and I probably don't look very—" "You look fine," Joe said firmly. "And Tommy's not exactly a fashion critic. Last week he insisted on wearing his Superman cape to the grocery store because he said it made the cart go faster." Despite everything, Autumn laughed a real laugh that transformed her entire face and reminded Joe that underneath the exhaustion and worry was a young woman who probably had a wonderful sense of humor when circumstances allowed for it. "If you're sure it wouldn't be a problem," she said. "I'm sure," Joe replied, standing up and pulling out his wallet to leave money for the check and tip. As he counted out the bills, most of his remaining cash, he caught Autumn watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Joe," she said quietly, "I meant what I said about paying you back. I don't know how or when, but I will find a way." "Don't worry about it," Joe said, though he appreciated the sentiment. "Sometimes the universe has a way of evening things out." They walked out of Rosie's diner together, back into the cool October evening that seemed less harsh now than it had an hour ago. Joe's old pickup truck sat in the parking lot, looking even more decrepit than usual next to the newer vehicles. But Autumn didn't seem to notice or care about its condition as Joe opened the passenger door for her. The truck's interior was clean but worn, with a car seat in the back that had obviously seen years of use, and a collection of Tommy's belongings scattered across the dashboard and floor, a few action figures, some baseball cards, a paperback book about dinosaurs, and what looked like half of a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "Sorry about the mess," Joe said, starting the engine and hoping it would turn over on the first try. Living with an 8-year-old is like sharing space with a very small tornado. I like it, Autumn said, settling into the passenger seat and looking around with genuine interest. It feels lived in, real. As they drove through Millfield's quiet streets, Joe found himself seeing his hometown through Autumn's eyes, the mix of struggling businesses and well-maintained homes, the evidence of a community that was working hard to maintain its identity despite economic challenges. He pointed out landmarks as they passed: the elementary school where Tommy was in 3rd grade, the park where they played catch on weekends, the library where Tommy checked out an impressive stack of books every Tuesday. He sounds like a special kid, Autumn said, listening to Joe's stories with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. He is, Joe agreed. Sometimes I think he's the one taking care of me instead of the other way around. He has this way of finding something good in every situation, no matter how bad things get. They pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story house in a neighborhood that had clearly been built during Millfield's more prosperous days. The houses were well maintained, but showed the careful attention to detail that suggested families stretching budgets to keep up appearances. Children's bicycles and toys scattered across front yards indicated that this was the kind of neighborhood where kids still played outside until their parents called them in for dinner. Marcus's mother, Jennifer, met them at the front door with the kind of warm smile that immediately put Autumn at ease. She was a woman in her early 30s with paint-stained fingers and laugh lines around her eyes, the kind of person who clearly made everyone feel welcome in her home. Joe. Perfect timing, Jennifer said, then paused as she noticed Autumn. I don't think we've met. I'm Jennifer Walsh. This is my friend Autumn, Joe said simply. Autumn, this is Jennifer. Her son Marcus is Tommy's partner in scientific destruction. Pleased to meet you, Autumn said, extending her hand with the kind of firm handshake that suggested military training but also genuine warmth. The boys are in the backyard, Jennifer said, leading them through a house that was clearly lived in and loved, with children's artwork on the refrigerator and family photos covering every available surface. Fair warning, they've been working on some kind of volcano project, and I think they've used every towel I own trying to clean up their experiments. Through the kitchen window, Joe could see Tommy and Marcus in the backyard, hunched over what appeared to be a cardboard mountain, covered in modeling clay. Both boys were wearing safety goggles that were far too big for their heads, and both were covered in what looked like a combination of baking soda, vinegar, and red food coloring. Tommy, Joe called through the open door. Time to clean up. Buddy, we need to head home. Tommy looked up, his face lighting up when he saw his father. But his expression shifted to curiosity when he noticed Autumn standing beside Joe. Dad, you have to see this, Tommy called, completely ignoring the instruction. To clean up. We made a volcano that actually erupts, and Marcus figured out how to make the lava different colors. That sounds very impressive, Joe said, stepping into the backyard with Autumn following. But first, I want you to meet my friend Autumn. She's a soldier. Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. At 8 years old, soldiers ranked somewhere between superheroes and astronauts in terms of impressiveness. He pulled off his oversized safety goggles and approached Autumn with the kind of awed respect usually reserved for celebrities. A real soldier? Tommy asked. Like, with a uniform and everything? That's right, Autumn said, crouching down to Tommy's eye level with the natural ease of someone who is comfortable around children. I just finished serving in the army. Did you ever drive a tank? Tommy asked, his voice filled with wonder. I didn't drive tanks, but I worked on helicopters, Autumn replied. I was a mechanic, which means I fixed engines and made sure everything worked properly. Tommy's face lit up even brighter. You know how to fix things? That's so cool. My dad is always trying to fix our truck, but sometimes it makes weird noises anyway. Well, Autumn said with a small smile, maybe I could take a look at it sometime and see if there's anything obvious wrong. Joe felt something warm and unexpected settle in his chest as he watched Tommy and Autumn interact. His son had always been friendly with adults, but there was something different about the way he was responding to Autumn, a kind of immediate trust and fascination that suggested he sensed something special about her. Can you show me how the volcano works? Autumn asked Tommy, and Joe could tell that her interest was genuine rather than the polite attention adults sometimes gave to children's projects. For the next 20 minutes, Joe watched as Tommy and Marcus demonstrated their volcanic creation while Autumn asked detailed questions about their process and offered suggestions for improvements. She treated their 8-year-old scientific endeavor with the same serious attention she might give to actual military equipment, and both boys clearly appreciated being taken seriously. She's really good with him, Jennifer murmured to Joe as they watched the demonstration from the kitchen doorway. Yeah, Joe agreed, feeling something he couldn't quite name as he watched Autumn help Tommy adjust the mixture for optimal eruption effect. She really is. As they finally gathered up Tommy's belongings and prepared to leave, Joe realized that something had shifted during their visit. What had started as a simple act of kindness between strangers was beginning to feel like something more substantial, the foundation of a real friendship perhaps, or even something that resembled the beginning of a found family. Walking back to the truck with Tommy chattering excitedly about volcanoes and Autumn listening with patient attention, Joe felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, good things were still possible. The first sign of trouble came as they were pulling out of Jennifer's driveway. Joe turned the key in the ignition, and instead of the truck's usual reluctant but reliable rumble, there was a grinding sound followed by a series of mechanical clicks that sounded like expensive problems. Uh-oh, Tommy said from the back seat. His 8-year-old understanding of automotive issues limited, but accurate. That doesn't sound good. Joe tried the ignition again, and this time the engine turned over, but immediately began making a noise that reminded him unpleasantly of a coffee grinder filled with marbles. He managed to get the truck moving, but the grinding sound got worse with each revolution of the wheels, and by the time they reached the end of Jennifer Street, it was clear they weren't going to make it much further. Joe, Autumn said quietly, her military training allowing her to assess mechanical problems, even from the passenger seat. You should probably pull over before this gets worse. Joe guided the truck to the curb and turned off the engine, his heart sinking as the reality of their situation settled over him. Without the truck, he couldn't get to work tomorrow. Without work, he couldn't pay rent, buy groceries, or handle any of the dozens of small financial obligations that kept their lives running. The truck wasn't just transportation, it was the thin line between stability and complete disaster. What's wrong with it, Dad? Tommy asked, his voice carrying the kind of practical concern that suggested he understood more about their financial situation than Joe wished he did. I'm not sure, buddy, Joe said, though the grinding sound had been pretty unmistakable. But I think we might be walking home tonight. It was only 3 miles from Jennifer's house to their apartment, and under normal circumstances, Joe wouldn't have minded the walk. But these weren't normal circumstances. It was getting dark. Tommy was tired from his day of scientific experimentation, and Joe had just spent most of his remaining money on dinner. The idea of walking 3 miles while carrying Tommy's school backpack and science project supplies felt overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and everything to do with the weight of accumulated stress. Can I take a look? Autumn asked, already reaching for the door handle. You don't have to do that, Joe said automatically. This isn't your problem. Maybe not, Autumn replied. But I told Tommy I work on engines, and I'd hate for him to think I was lying. She climbed out of the truck and popped the hood with the kind of confident efficiency that suggested she actually knew what she was doing. Joe and Tommy joined her at the front of the vehicle, watching as she examined the engine with the systematic attention of someone who had diagnosed mechanical problems under much more challenging circumstances than a quiet residential street in Millfield. "Well, the good news is, it's not the engine," Autumn said after a few minutes of careful inspection. "The bad news is, it's your transmission, and from the sound it was making, I'd say you've got maybe one more trip in this truck before it stops moving altogether." Joe felt his stomach drop. He'd been nursing the transmission along for months, adding fluid when it leaked and avoiding the kind of aggressive driving that might push it over the edge. But apparently his careful maintenance hadn't been enough. "How much does it cost to fix a transmission?" Tommy asked, his voice small. Joe and Autumn exchanged a look over the boy's head. They both knew the answer, and they both knew it was an amount of money that might as well have been $1 million for someone in Joe's position. "More than we have right now, buddy," Joe said gently. "But we'll figure something out." As they walked home through Millfield's quiet streets, Joe carrying Tommy piggyback for the last mile. When the boy's energy finally gave out, Joe tried to calculate their options. The temp agency might have work for him next week, but without transportation, he couldn't get to any job sites outside walking distance. He could try to borrow money for transmission repair, but the few people he knew who might have that kind of cash were dealing with their own financial challenges. The reality was stark and undeniable. Without the truck, their already precarious situation was about to become genuinely desperate. Back at their small apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage, Joe got Tommy settled with a bath and bedtime story, while Autumn waited in their tiny living room, looking around at the space that told the story of a father and son making the best of limited resources. The furniture was secondhand but clean. The walls were decorated with Tommy's artwork and school photos, and everything was organized with the kind of careful efficiency that came from having no room for waste or clutter. When Joe emerged from Tommy's bedroom an hour later, he found Autumn sitting on their old couch, staring out the window at the dark street below. She'd been quiet during the walk home, and Joe could see that she was wrestling with something. "I should probably head out," she said, standing up as he entered the room. "You've done more than enough for me already, and I don't want to be in the way when you're dealing with your truck situation." "Where are you going to go?" Joe asked. "It's past 8 o'clock, and you said yourself you don't have money for a bus ticket." Autumn shrugged, a gesture that was trying to appear casual but mostly looked lost. "I'll figure something out. Maybe find a shelter or a church that's open late." "Absolutely not," Joe said firmly. "You can take the couch tonight. We'll figure out tomorrow when tomorrow gets here." "Joe, I can't keep accepting your help," Autumn said, her voice tight with frustration. "You bought me dinner, you let me meet your son, and now you want to give me a place to sleep when you're facing your own crisis. When does it end?" Joe studied her face for a moment, seeing not just pride, but genuine distress at being unable to reciprocate the kindness she'd received. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you're not used to accepting help because you're used to being the one who provides it. I think you spent years taking care of other people, your fellow soldiers, your friends, people who needed what you could give. And now you're on the receiving end, and it doesn't feel right." Autumn's composure finally cracked, and Joe could see tears forming in her eyes. "I hate this," she said quietly. "I hate feeling helpless. I hate having nothing to offer except gratitude. I hate that you're facing problems I can't solve when you've been nothing but kind to me. Can I tell you something?" Joe said, sitting down on the couch and gesturing for her to join him. "The night Sarah died, I came home from the hospital and found casseroles filling up our refrigerator. The neighbors had organized a meal train, and for weeks, people brought us food. At first, I was grateful. But after a while, I started to hate it. Not the food we needed the food, but the feeling of being someone's charity case." Autumn sat down beside him, listening intently. It took me a long time to understand that letting people help you isn't just about receiving, Joe continued. It's about giving them the chance to be the kind of person they want to be. Every person who brought us a casserole went home feeling like they'd done something meaningful, something that mattered. I was so focused on my own pride that I almost missed the fact that they needed the help as much as we needed the help. He looked at her directly. You want to do something for me? Let me be the kind of person who doesn't leave a friend to sleep on the street when I have a perfectly good couch. Let me be the kind of person my son can be proud of. Autumn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, managing a small smile. When you put it like that, it seems selfish to refuse. Exactly, Joe said. It would be practically cruel. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the day finally settling over both of them. Outside, Millfield was settling into its quiet nighttime rhythm, and inside their small apartment, two people who had been strangers 12 hours ago were learning what it meant to trust each other with their vulnerabilities. Joe, Autumn said finally, her voice carrying a strange note that Joe couldn't quite identify. Can I ask you something? Sure. If someone offered you a chance to change your situation, I mean really change it, not just fix the immediate problem, but actually build something better, would you take it? Joe frowned, not sure where the question was leading. I guess that would depend on what the offer was, and what it would cost. What if it didn't cost you anything? Autumn asked. What if it was just an opportunity, but one that would require you to trust someone you barely know? Joe studied her face, seeing something in her expression that suggested this wasn't a hypothetical question. Autumn, he said slowly. What? Are you trying to tell me? She took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. I need to show you something. Autumn reached for her army backpack with hands that Joe noticed were trembling slightly. She unzipped the main compartment and carefully removed a manila envelope that had clearly been protected from the elements during her travels. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and bore the letterhead of Patterson, Williams and Associates, attorneys at law. Remember when I said I was traveling to Colorado to visit my friend's grave? Autumn said, setting the envelope on the coffee table between them. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Joe watched as she opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents, along with something that made his breath catch in his throat, a set of keys. Attached to a simple keychain that read, Coleman's Automotive. 3 months ago, I got a call from a lawyer here in Millfield, Autumn continued, her voice steady but quiet. He told me that my great-aunt Martha had passed away and left me something in her will. I'd never even met Aunt Martha. There was some kind of family falling out before I was born, but apparently she'd been following my military service through newspaper clippings and letters my mother sent her. She held up the keys, and they caught the light from the table lamp, gleaming like small promises. She left me her house and her business, Autumn said. Coleman's Automotive Repair, right here in Millfield. The lawyer said it's been closed since. She got sick 6 months ago, but everything is still there, all the equipment, all the tools, even the customer records. Joe stared at the keys, then at Autumn, trying to process what she was telling him. You own an auto repair shop? Technically, yes, but I've been too scared to actually claim it. Autumn's voice cracked slightly. I've been carrying these keys for almost 2 weeks, sleeping rough because I was terrified to use them. What if the lawyer made a mistake? What if I get there and it's not real? What if I can't handle running a business? She looked up at Joe, tears forming in her eyes. I've been trained to fix helicopters and military vehicles under combat conditions, but I don't know the first thing about customer service, or business licenses or insurance or any of the things you need to actually run a shop. Joe felt like the world had tilted sideways. Here was this woman he'd met just hours ago, who he'd bought dinner for with his last $20, and she was telling him she owned the solution to not just his immediate transportation crisis, but potentially his entire financial situation. Autumn, he said carefully. Are you saying what I think you're saying? She took a shaky breath. When your truck broke down tonight, and you talked about not being able to work without transportation, and Tommy asked about the cost of transmission repair, I realized that maybe this isn't just coincidence. Maybe this is the universe trying to tell us something. She pulled out additional documents from the envelope, what looked like property deeds, business licenses, and inventory lists. The shop is fully equipped, Joe. According to these papers, it has hydraulic lifts, a full tool inventory, diagnostic equipment, even a small office with a computer. And there's a 2-bedroom apartment upstairs that Aunt Martha used to rent out for extra income. Joe's mind was racing, trying to understand the implications of what she was showing him. What are you proposing? Partnership, Autumn said, the word hanging in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. You handle the business side, customer relations, scheduling, local connections, all the things I don't know how to do. I handle the technical repairs, the heavy mechanical work, the parts ordering. We split everything 50-50. Joe stared at her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Autumn, that's incredible, but we just met. You don't know anything about me beyond what I've told you in one evening. I know you gave a hungry stranger your last $20, she replied immediately. I know you're raising a son by yourself and doing whatever work you can find to keep him fed and housed. I know you wanted to be a teacher, which tells me you're intelligent and care about helping people. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope mixed with desperation. But most importantly, I know that when you saw someone in need, you didn't hesitate to help, even when it cost you everything you had. That tells me more about your character than a dozen references or background checks ever could. Joe felt his head spinning. The offer was everything he'd never dared to dream of: stable work, the chance to use skills he'd been developing for years, an opportunity to build something real instead of just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. But it was also terrifying in its scope and implications. Why me? He asked. You could find an experienced mechanic, someone who actually knows the automotive business. Because experienced mechanics already have jobs, Autumn said. And because most of them wouldn't understand what it's like to count every penny, to worry about whether there's enough money for groceries, to feel like you're one crisis away from losing everything you've worked for. She gestured around their small apartment, taking in the evidence of Joe's careful management of limited resources. You've kept your family together, kept your son happy and healthy, maintained your dignity and kindness even when things got tough. Those aren't skills you learn in technical school, Joe. Those are the kind of character traits that can't be taught. Joe stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street where his broken-down truck sat like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life lately. Behind him, he could hear Autumn gathering up the papers, probably preparing to put them away and pretend this conversation had never happened. There's something else, she said quietly. The lawyer mentioned that Aunt Martha specifically requested that whoever inherited the business should find good people to work with. People who understand that fixing things is about more than just mechanical problems. Joe turned back to face her. What does that mean? I think, Autumn said, holding up the keys again, it means she would have liked you. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small living room, both understanding that they were standing at a crossroads that would determine the direction of their lives. Joe thought about Tommy, asleep in the next room, and about the security and stability that a successful business could provide. He thought about his own skills and interests, about how much he'd always enjoyed the puzzle-solving aspect of mechanical work, but mostly, he thought about the woman sitting on his couch, who had traveled hundreds of miles with almost no resources to honor a promise to a dead friend, who had been carrying the keys to a new life, but had been too afraid to use them alone. Can I see the shop? He asked finally. Autumn's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement. You mean tonight? "I mean right now," Joe said, reaching for his jacket. "If we're going to do this, if we're really going to trust each other with something this big, then I want to see what we're getting into." As they prepared to leave the apartment, stepping out into the cool October night that had already changed their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, Joe felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the thrilling, terrifying sensation of possibility stretching out before him like an open road. The walk to Coleman's Automotive took them through parts of Millfield that Joe knew well, but somehow looked different in the pale moonlight. They passed the old textile mill that had been shuttered since the 80s, its broken windows reflecting the streetlights like empty eyes. They walked by the elementary school where Tommy learned to read, past the corner market where Joe had been planning to buy bread and peanut butter with his last few dollars, past all the familiar landmarks of a life that suddenly felt like it might be about to change completely. Autumn walked beside him in silence, clutching the keys in her right hand and the manila envelope under her left arm. Every few steps, Joe could see her glance at him sideways, as if she was still trying to convince herself that this was really happening, that she wasn't about to wake up from a dream and find herself back on the concrete steps outside Rosie's diner. "It's just around this corner," she said as they turned onto Birch Street, her voice barely above a whisper. "I walked past it twice yesterday, but I couldn't bring myself to actually go in." Birch Street was part of Millfield's original commercial district, a stretch of two-story brick buildings that had housed everything from hardware stores to barbershops to small manufacturing businesses back when the town's economy was robust enough to support such enterprises. Many of the buildings now stood empty, their windows papered over with "faded for lease" signs that had been there so long they'd become part of the landscape. But as they walked down the quiet street, Joe could see that some businesses were still hanging on. There was Martinez's Restaurant Supply, which had managed to survive by serving customers throughout the county. There was Chun's Laundromat, which stayed busy because many of the older apartment buildings in town didn't have their own facilities. And there, halfway down the block, was a building that looked different from the others, maintained, cared for, with a sign above the front door that read, "Coleman's Automotive Repair," in neat, professional lettering, even in the dim light from the street lamps. Joe could see that the building was solid, well constructed, the kind of place that had been built to last. The large bay doors that would accommodate vehicles were closed, but they looked to be in good condition. The windows were clean, and there was no evidence of the neglect or vandalism that had claimed some of the other empty buildings on the street. "She kept it up, even when she got sick," Autumn said, following Joe's gaze. "The lawyer said she hired someone to maintain the building and keep the equipment in working order, even after she had to stop operating the business." They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, both of them staring at the building that represented such different things to each of them. For Autumn, it was a connection to a family member she'd never known, a legacy she wasn't sure she deserved. For Joe, it was the possibility of everything he'd never dared to hope for: meaningful work, financial stability, the chance to build something lasting for Tommy's future. "Are you ready?" Autumn asked, holding up the keys. Joe nodded, though he wasn't sure ready was the right word for what he was feeling. Hopeful, maybe. Terrified, definitely. But ready implied a level of preparation that he wasn't sure anyone could have for a moment like this. Autumn walked to the front door and inserted the key with hands that shook only slightly. The lock turned smoothly, and the door opened with a soft click that sounded surprisingly loud in the quiet night. She reached inside and found the light switch, and suddenly the interior of Coleman's Automotive was revealed in all its surprising glory. Joe stepped inside and immediately felt his breath catch in his throat. The shop was immaculate, organized with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of someone who understood that efficiency and safety went hand in hand. 2 hydraulic lifts dominated the main work area, both looking to be in excellent condition. Along the walls, pegboards held tools arranged in perfect order, every wrench and socket in its designated place. Diagnostic equipment that Joe recognized, but had never had the chance to use, sat on rolling carts, clean and well-maintained. "This is incredible," Joe breathed, walking slowly through the space and taking in details that confirmed what the paperwork had promised. This wasn't just a garage where someone had tinkered with cars as a hobby. This was a professional operation, equipped to handle everything from basic maintenance to complex engine rebuilds. "There's more," Autumn said, leading him toward the back of the shop. "The office is through here, and the apartment is upstairs." The office was small but efficiently laid out, with a desk, filing cabinets, and a computer that looked to be only a few years old. The walls were covered with charts showing parts diagrams and maintenance schedules, and a large calendar hung beside the desk with appointments marked in neat handwriting that ended abruptly in April, presumably when Martha Coleman had become too ill to continue working. "She was still taking appointments right up until the end," Autumn said, following Joe's gaze to the calendar. "The lawyer said she loved this place, loved helping people keep their cars running so they could get to work and take care of their families." Joe felt something tighten in his chest at that description. It was exactly the kind of work he'd always imagined doing if he'd had the resources to start his own business, work that mattered, that helped people solve real problems in their daily lives. "Can we see the apartment?" he asked. They climbed a narrow staircase at the back of the office, emerging into a living space that was modest but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a living room with windows that looked out over Birch Street. The furniture was dated, but well-maintained, and everything was clean and ready for occupancy. "The lawyer said Aunt Martha rented this out for years," Autumn explained as they walked through the rooms. "It was steady income that helped keep the business afloat during slow periods." Joe stood in the larger bedroom, looking out the window at the view of Millfield's quiet streets, and tried to imagine what it would be like to live here with Tommy. The boy would have his own room for the first time since Sarah died. They'd have a real kitchen where Joe could cook proper meals instead of relying on whatever could be heated up quickly after long days at temporary jobs. Most importantly, they'd have stability, the kind of security that came from owning something real instead of constantly worrying about the next paycheck. "Joe," Autumn said quietly from the doorway, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just me offering you a job. If we do this, if we become partners, it means we're trusting each other with everything we have. Your future, Tommy's future. My entire inheritance from someone I never even met. That's not a decision anyone should make lightly." Joe turned to face her, seeing in her expression the same mixture of hope and terror that he was feeling. She was right, of course. What they were contemplating was enormous, life-changing in ways that couldn't be undone if things went wrong. "What are you most afraid of?" he asked. Autumn was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I'm afraid that I'm not who she thought I was," she said finally. "Aunt Martha left this to me based on newspaper clippings and letters from my mother. She never met me, never saw how I handle stress or conflict or failure. What if I'm not capable of running a business? What if I let her down? And what if you're exactly who she hoped you'd be?" Joe countered. "What if she left this to you because she saw something in those newspaper clippings that told her you were someone who could be trusted with something this important?" They walked back downstairs together, through the office and into the main shop area, where the tools and equipment waited in silent readiness for someone to bring them back to life. "What about you?" Autumn asked. "What scares you about this?" Joe looked around the shop, taking in the evidence of all the work that could be done here, all the problems that could be solved, all the people who could be helped. "I'm afraid that I want this too much," he said honestly. "I'm afraid that I'll convince myself it's a good idea because I need it to be, not because it actually is." "But you do want it," Autumn said. "It wasn't a question." "More than I've wanted anything in years," Joe admitted. "Not just for me, but for Tommy. I want him to grow up seeing that it's possible to build something meaningful, something that lasts. I want him to understand that work can be about more than just survival. Autumn nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Lisa, my friend who died, she used to say that the best decisions weren't the safe ones or the smart ones. They were the ones that scared you but felt right anyway. They stood in the center of the shop, surrounded by all the possibilities that Martha Coleman's legacy represented, both of them understanding that they were at a crossroads that would determine the course of their lives. If we do this, Joe said slowly, if we really become partners, we'll need to be completely honest with each other. About money, about decisions, about problems when they come up. And they will come up. I know, Autumn said. Business partnerships fail all the time, especially when they're between people who don't really know each other. But they also succeed, Joe pointed out. Sometimes the best partnerships are between people who complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, who bring different skills to the same goal. Autumn walked over to one of the tool benches and picked up a wrench, turning it over in her hands as if testing its weight and balance. I know how to fix almost anything with an engine, she said. But I don't know how to talk to customers, how to estimate costs, how to handle the business side of things. And I know this town, know the people, understand how to build relationships and solve problems that aren't necessarily mechanical, Joe replied. But I've never had access to equipment like this, never had the chance to really develop my technical skills. They looked at each other across the shop, both of them understanding that what they were really discussing wasn't just a business partnership but a leap of faith in each other and in the possibility that two broken people could build something whole together. There's one more thing, Autumn said, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. The lawyer gave me this. It's a letter Aunt Martha wrote to whoever inherited the business. She handed the paper to Joe, who unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat but shaky, obviously written by someone who was seriously ill but determined to communicate something important. To whoever reads this, the letter began. I hope you understand that Coleman's Automotive was never just about fixing cars. It was about fixing the things that keep people moving forward in their lives. Cars break down, but so do dreams and hopes and plans. Sometimes the most important repair work happens in the conversation, while the actual mechanical work is being done. I hope you'll remember that the people who come here aren't just customers, they're neighbors who trust you with something they depend on. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. And remember that the best work happens when good people work together. Don't try to do everything alone. Find partners you can trust, people who share your values and your commitment to doing things right. The tools and equipment will serve you well, but it's the people you work with who will determine whether this place becomes just a business or something more meaningful. Good luck, and thank you for carrying this forward. Joe finished reading and looked up to find Autumn watching him intently. She would have liked you, Autumn said softly. How can you be sure? Because, Autumn said, taking the letter back and folding it carefully, you're exactly the kind of person she was hoping would help carry this forward. Joe walked over to one of the hydraulic lifts and ran his hand along the metal frame, feeling the solid reality of it under his palm. Everything he'd dreamed of was here, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. Okay, he said, the word coming out more quietly than he'd intended. Okay? Autumn asked. Joe turned to face her, feeling something settle into place inside his chest, a kind of certainty he hadn't felt since before Sarah got sick. Okay, he said again, louder this time. Let's do this. Let's be partners. The smile that spread across Autumn's face was like watching the sun rise after the longest night of the year. She walked over to him and extended her hand, and when Joe shook it, he felt like he was sealing a pact that would change everything, not just for him and Tommy, but for Autumn too. and maybe even for the entire community of people who would bring their broken cars and their worried faces to Coleman and Morris Automotive. Outside, Millfield slept on, unaware that two lives had just taken a dramatic turn toward hope. 8 months later, on a warm Saturday morning in June, Joe Morris stood in the doorway of Coleman and Morris Automotive and watched his son, Tommy, demonstrate the proper way to change a tire to 3 younger kids from the neighborhood. The boy's hands were already stained with honest grease, and his explanation was peppered with the kind of technical vocabulary that came from spending afternoons in a working garage where questions were encouraged and curiosity was rewarded. See, you gotta make sure the lug nuts are tight, but not too tight, Tommy was saying to his audience of 7- and 8-year-olds, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who had learned these lessons through careful observation and practice. My dad says if you over-tighten them, you can warp the wheel, and then you got a bigger problem than just a flat tire. Joe smiled, remembering a time when Tommy's biggest concern had been whether there would be enough money for school lunch, when their entire world had felt precarious and uncertain. Now the boy moved through the shop with the confidence that came from stability, from knowing that their place would be here tomorrow and next month and next year. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks had been a whirlwind of paperwork and planning, of learning to work together and figuring out how to blend their different approaches into something that served their customers effectively. Autumn's technical expertise and military precision had meshed surprisingly well with Joe's people skills and understanding of the local community. She could diagnose a complex transmission problem in minutes, while he could explain the repair to a worried customer in terms that made sense and didn't feel like a lecture or a sales pitch. Their first customer had been Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow whose ancient Buick had been making concerning noises for months. She'd been putting off the repair because she was afraid it would cost more than she could afford. But when Joe explained their payment plan options and Autumn showed her exactly what needed to be fixed and why, the relief on her face had reminded both partners why they were doing this work. Word had spread quickly through Millfield's tight-knit community. Within 3 months, they had a steady stream of customers who appreciated not just the quality of their work, but the way they were treated with respect, honesty, and genuine concern for their transportation needs. Joe had started offering a shuttle service for customers who needed to get to work while their cars were being repaired, using the old truck that Autumn had fixed as her first project in the shop. Tommy had suggested painting Coleman and Morris Courtesy Shuttle on the side, and his proudly designed logo had become a familiar sight around town. The apartment above the shop had become a real home for Joe and Tommy, with a kitchen where they cooked actual meals together and a living room where Tommy could spread out his homework while Joe worked on business paperwork in the evenings. Tommy's bedroom was decorated with posters of race cars and spacecraft, and his bookshelf was filled with stories about adventures and heroes, and the kinds of dreams that seemed possible when you weren't worried about whether there would be money for rent next month. Autumn had moved into a small house just 3 blocks away, close enough to walk to work, but far enough to maintain her independence. She'd kept the apartment available for rental income, which had proven to be wise since a young teacher named Sarah Kim had moved to Millfield to work at the elementary school and needed affordable housing close to downtown. The business had grown beyond their most optimistic projections. They'd hired Bobby Chun part-time to help with the increasing workload, and Jennifer Walsh had started handling their bookkeeping and scheduling. What had begun as a desperate partnership between 2 strangers had evolved into a genuine community business that employed local people and served local needs. But more than the financial success, what Joe treasured most was the way their partnership had deepened into real friendship. Autumn had dinner with them twice a week, and Tommy had started calling her Aunt Autumn without being prompted by anyone. She'd taught him basic mechanical skills and listened to his school presentations, and in return, he'd helped her learn to navigate the social complexities of small-town life that had sometimes puzzled someone accustomed to the more straightforward hierarchies of military service. On holidays and birthdays, they'd started including Jennifer and Marcus, and Bobby and his family, creating the kind of chosen family that formed naturally around shared work and mutual respect. Tommy now had what he'd never had before: a stable community of adults who cared about his welfare and took interest in his education and development. Joe was pulled from his reflections by the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot with the distinctive wheeze of an engine that was working harder than it should. Through the open bay doors he could see a beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days several years ago. The driver who emerged was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. Her face carried the particular expression of someone dealing with car trouble on a limited budget, frustrated, worried, and trying to calculate how much financial disaster this might represent. "Excuse me," she called toward the shop, her voice tentative but hopeful. "Are you open? My car's been making weird noises, and I'm afraid it's going to break down completely." Joe walked over to greet her, noting the way she glanced nervously at the diagnostic equipment and tool displays, clearly trying to estimate costs she probably couldn't afford. "I'm Joe Morris," he said, extending his hand with the same easy warmth that had become his trademark with nervous customers. "This is my shop, and we're definitely open. What kind of noises are we talking about?" "Grinding mostly," the young woman said, shaking his hand gratefully. "Especially when I try to brake. I work at the nursing home outside town, and I can't afford to miss shifts. But I'm terrified this thing is going to leave me stranded somewhere." Joe heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Autumn emerging from under the hood of a pickup truck they'd been servicing, wiping her hands on a shop towel. Her hair was pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, and her work clothes were clean but showed the evidence of a morning spent solving other people's problems. "Sounds like brake pads," Autumn said, joining the conversation with the direct but friendly manner that had made her popular with customers who appreciated straight talk. "Mind if I take a listen?" "Take a listen?" As Autumn conducted her preliminary assessment of the brake system, Joe found himself thinking about the evening 8 months ago, when he'd encountered a hungry soldier outside Rosie's diner and made the decision to spend his last $20 on a stranger's dinner. That choice had seemed enormous at the time, risky in ways that his practical mind had warned against. But what he understood now was that the real risk had been in not acting, in allowing fear and caution to override the instinct to help someone in need. Every good thing that had happened since the partnership with Autumn, the stability for Tommy, the success of their business, the community they'd built had grown from that single moment of choosing kindness over self-protection. "Good news." Autumn called from where she was examining the brake system. "It's definitely the pads, but the rotors look fine. We can have you fixed up in about an hour, and it won't cost you more than $60. The relief on the young woman's face was immediate and profound. "Really? I was afraid it was going to be hundreds of dollars." "Not this time," Joe said with a smile. "And if money's tight, we can work out a payment plan. The important thing is getting you back on the road safely." As they moved the sedan into the shop and began the repair work, Joe watched Autumn explain the process to their customer with the same patient thoroughness she brought to every job. This was what Martha Coleman had meant in her letter about fixing more than just mechanical problems. They weren't just replacing brake pads. They were giving this young woman the security of knowing her car was reliable, the confidence that she could get to work and back without fear of breakdown, the peace of mind that came from dealing with people who treated her fairly. Tommy appeared at Joe's elbow, having finished his tire-changing demonstration and now curious about the new arrival. "Dad, can I help with the brake job?" he asked, his voice carrying the eager enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved learning new skills. "If it's okay with Ms." Joe looked questioningly at their customer. "Rebecca," she said. "Rebecca Martinez. And I'd love to see how it's done." I don't know anything about cars, but I figure I should probably learn some basics. For the next hour, the shop was filled with the sounds of productive work and easy conversation. Autumn walked Rebecca and Tommy through each step of the brake pad replacement, explaining not just what she was doing, but why it mattered and how to recognize the warning signs before problems became emergencies. Joe handled the paperwork and called to check on the status of parts they were expecting for other jobs, but mostly he just enjoyed watching his partner and his son share their knowledge with someone who needed it. When the work was finished and Rebecca was preparing to leave, she paused at the front door of the shop and turned back to face them. "I just want you to know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this place is special. I've been to other auto shops where they made me feel stupid for not knowing anything about cars, or where I felt like they were trying to take advantage of me because I'm young and female. But you all treated me like family." After Rebecca drove away, her car running smoothly and quietly, Joe found himself standing in the same doorway where he'd watched Tommy's tire demonstration earlier. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across the shop floor where tools were already being organized for Monday's work. Autumn joined him, leaning against the doorframe and surveying their domain with the satisfaction of someone who had found her place in the world. "You know what I realized today?" she said. "What's that?" 8 months ago, I was sitting on concrete steps outside a diner, counting pocket change and trying to figure out how I was going to eat. I had everything I needed to change my life in my backpack, but I was too scared to use it. She gestured toward the shop where Tommy was carefully organizing wrenches according to size, his young face serious with concentration. "But you weren't too scared to help a stranger, even when it meant giving away money you couldn't afford to lose. And that choice, your choice to see me as someone worth helping instead of someone to avoid, that's what made all of this possible." Joe thought about that night, about the moment when he decided to trust his instincts over his fears, to choose generosity over caution. It had felt like a small gesture at the time, insignificant compared to the magnitude of their respective problems. "I think," he said slowly, "it was the other way around. You were the one who had the courage to trust a complete stranger with an inheritance that represented your entire future. I just bought you dinner. You bought me hope," Autumn corrected gently. "And then you gave me the chance to turn that hope into something real." As the sun set over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of their shop, Joe felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that his life had meaning beyond mere survival. Tomorrow more people would bring them their broken cars and their worried faces, and he and Autumn would work together to solve problems both mechanical and human. Tommy would continue to grow up in a stable home where hard work was valued and kindness was practiced daily. The community would continue to benefit from having a local business that prioritized fair dealing over maximum profit. And somewhere out there, perhaps another person in desperate circumstances would encounter someone willing to extend a helping hand, continuing the cycle of compassion that had transformed all their lives. The choice Joe had made outside Rosie's Diner 8 months ago had cost him $20. But what he'd received in return, partnership, purpose, family, hope, was beyond any calculation of value. Sometimes, he thought as he locked up the shop and prepared to walk home with his son, the greatest investments were the ones that looked like losses at the time. Sometimes giving away your last dollar was the first step toward receiving everything you never knew you needed. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe was waiting for exactly the right moment to remind you that kindness was never wasted, that courage was always rewarded, and that the best partnerships were built not on contracts or guarantees, but on the simple recognition that we all needed someone willing to say, "You're not alone." In the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled like small promises against the gathering darkness, and Joe Morris walked home to dinner with his son, grateful beyond measure for the moment when he'd chosen to help a stranger and discovered that he was really choosing to help himself. 5 years later, on another cold October evening, Tommy Morris, now 13 and working part-time at Coleman and Morris Automotive after school, was walking home when he spotted a familiar scene outside the new community center on Maple Street. A young man, probably college-aged, sat on the front steps with his head in his hands and a backpack at his feet. Even from a distance, Tommy could see the tension in his shoulders, the defeated slump that spoke of someone who had run out of options and didn't know where to turn next. Tommy paused, remembering countless stories his father had told him about the importance of paying attention to people who needed help, about recognizing when someone was struggling and choosing to act rather than walk away. He thought about the photograph that hung in their shop office, a picture of his dad and Aunt Autumn on opening day, both of them grinning while holding a sign that read, "Grand Opening, where every problem has a solution." "Hey," Tommy called out, approaching the steps with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up understanding that kindness was a strength, not a weakness. "You okay?" The young man looked up, revealing a face marked by exhaustion and worry. "Just trying to figure out my next move," he said with a bitter laugh. "Lost my job, got evicted from my apartment, and my car died about 2 miles from here. Perfect trifecta." Tommy sat down on the steps beside him, ignoring the cold concrete that immediately began seeping through his jeans. "That's rough. I'm Tommy, by the way." "Alex," the young man replied. "And thanks for stopping. But unless you've got a magic solution to unemployment and homelessness, I'm probably beyond help right now." Tommy grinned, the same kind of smile that his father used when he was about to surprise someone with unexpected good news. "Well, I don't know about magic, but I might know about solutions. My family runs an auto shop a few blocks from here, and we're always looking for good people. Can't promise anything, but if you're willing to work hard and learn, we might be able to help you get back on your feet." Alex stared at him, clearly not believing that help could appear so simply, so unexpectedly. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Tommy stood up and extended his hand, thinking about all the stories he'd heard about the night his father met Aunt Autumn, about the $20 dinner that had changed 3 lives forever. "Because," he said, echoing words he'd heard his father say countless times, "sometimes the best investments are the ones that look like risks at the time. Come on, let's go talk to my dad." As they walked together through Millfield's quiet streets, Tommy felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that kindness wasn't just something you received, it was something you gave forward, creating an endless chain of hope that connected strangers and transformed communities, one act of compassion at a time. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, carried forward by people who understood that the most important choice anyone could make was the simple decision to help. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.